Over the past decade, 4 distinct digital initiatives have moved out of the research phase and fused into a highly integrated financial architecture. We label this the ABCD system. It combines artificial intelligence-enabled compliance, biometric digital identification, central bank digital currency, and an integrated digital control layer linking identity directly to payment authorization. This graph tracks the system's operational efficiency relative to user adoption. Features like programmable payments, automated compliance, and behavioral surveillance require near-universal transaction coverage to function. Ultimately, an architecture designed to monitor the economy fails if a substantial portion of the economy operates outside its perimeter. The system's utility maximizes only as participation approaches 100%. Because of this network dependency, administrators cannot rely on voluntary adoption. They are forced to actively construct a regulatory environment where non-compliant transactions become legally costly, progressively deploying direct requirements, severely restricting physical cash, and centralizing payment intermediation. Total systemic coverage is not a policy preference. It is a mathematical and economic requirement for the architecture to survive. The historical record shows that comprehensive mandate regimes uniformly trigger a defined refusing population. A system demanding total compliance inevitably fractures its participant base. We term this demographic the resistant remnant. This group includes theological and ideological objectors, privacy-focused refusers, and those who are simply excluded by the technology itself. Combined, they form a permanent structural feature of the economy, not a temporary behavioral anomaly. We see this response rapidly activate under systemic stress. During the Lebanese banking collapse of 2019, the formal system effectively confiscated depositor wealth. Within months, citizens replaced the disabled banking channels with cash dollarization, stablecoins, and informal diaspora networks. Similarly, when Greek capital controls locked citizens out of their digital accounts in 2015, barter networks and informal foreign exchange markets emerged within days. These are not just emergency backups, they are durable institutions. The Swiss Wehrbank has operated alongside the formal system for over 90 years, and the Hawala network has handled billions in value transfer for 12 centuries. Whether during Soviet-era shadow markets or modern Swiss cooperatives, parallel systems consistently capture between 10 and 30% of economic activity. Because this refusing population is diverse, motivated, and historically persistent, the rollout of the ABCD system leads to a permanent two-tier economy. To sustain economic life under the ABCD mandate, the resistant remnants requires a specific engineering schematic. We organize this via an 8-component framework called ROPE-FEIS. The first component is resilience against selective repression. The Soviet shadow economy survived 7 decades of state suppression by embedding itself within formal arrangements and distributing its operational load. A parallel system that relies on a single institutional target will be disrupted. Load must be distributed. The second component is open source. Institutional templates and operational rules must be publicly available, so any community can replicate them without centralized approval. However, the specific participant graph, the identity of the users, must remain strictly closed to prevent regulatory mapping. The third component is parallel operation. This system is adversarial yet coexistent. It is built to operate alongside the formal ABCD system for specific financial functions, rather than attempting a complete replacement of the national economy. Survival against a digital mandate relies on distributing trust widely across small, local networks, rather than consolidating it into a highly visible, regulated entity. Contemporary parallel designs often rely entirely on blockchain and decentralized ledgers, assuming cryptography provides ultimate defense against financial repression. This assumption contains a fatal flaw. The ABCD system's administrative perimeter controls the physical infrastructure that digital privacy relies on. Internet service providers and biometric device authentication and smart-metered electrical grids are all vulnerable to selective denial. Therefore, the framework dictates an electronicless core. True resilience demands an operational base that functions completely without digital rails.
Electronics are permitted only as optional, marginal enhancements when conditions are favorable. During the 1933 U.S. gold confiscation, the federal government mandated the surrender of high-density physical wealth. The population that quietly retained its gold sustained a parallel store of value across 4 decades of formal illegality, proving the necessity of physical assets outside administrative control. Physical ledgers and analog tokens bypass the surveillance layer entirely.
They generate zero network traffic, zero biometric pings, and zero behavioral metadata for algorithms to flag. If your parallel economy depends on the adversary's telecommunications and power infrastructure to clear a transaction, it is not parallel, it is captive. Stripping away electronic rails forces us to define the internal mechanics of the system. We have to map how value actually moves and clears. The financial component requires localized payments and settlement. At the community scale, this is achieved through mutual credit clearing systems, where participants record bilateral obligations and settle them periodically with physical goods or analog currency. Without algorithmic smart contracts to enforce payment, these financial functions are secured entirely by reputation. Trust networks act as the mitigating force against fraud and free riding. The economic component involves matching supply and demand. Without centralized digital directories, this relies on analog discovery, periodic printed catalogs, community bulletin boards, and direct oral communication within the participant network. These analog mechanisms contain high transactional friction. They are slower, require significantly more manual coordination than the ABCD grid's algorithmic efficiency. Parallel economies deliberately accept this friction. The operational drag of physical ledgers is the exact cost paid to guarantee absolute transactional autonomy and privacy. Because this system coexists with the formal economy, participants will still face mandatory external costs, like taxes or highly specialized capital expenditures. This requires interoperability. Interaction with the formal grid is managed by designated interface brokers. These are specialized roles designed to execute boundary transactions without exposing the internal community graph to external regulatory mapping. The primary defense here is minimization. By funneling necessary external interactions through a handful of routine, unproblematic interface points, the surveillance perimeter sees only standard economic activity, keeping the broader parallel network invisible. Finally, these components must integrate into a single system. A collection of independent practices is not an architecture. The framework requires formal, process-based integration, where every component reinforces the others. Adopting these criteria selectively creates predictable vulnerabilities. Implementing analog ledgers without strict network boundary controls, or publishing open-source templates without building local trust networks, will cause the arrangement to fail under pressure. The ROPE-FEIS architecture only functions when applied as a rigorous engineering discipline. As early-stage parallel arrangements consolidate into mature operations, administrators of the formal system will recognize the leakage. This initiates Phase 3 of the trajectory, mandate intensification. During this period, administrators will enact anti-circumvention legislation intended to actively crush the operating space of the parallel tier. This matrix plots the anticipated regulatory expansion. We expect progressive reductions in cash reporting thresholds, leading to outright prohibitions of physical cash for specific categories, like real estate and vehicles. Furthermore, existing legal definitions for money services businesses will be stretched to capture informal, community-level value transfers, turning historically unproblematic arrangements into compliance targets. However, the regulatory net cannot be cast indefinitely. Political realities and historical constitutional constraints, particularly regarding religious and community accommodations, ensure that deliberate legal gray areas remain. Severe legal friction and administrative targeting is a baked-in feature of operating a parallel environment. It is a known variable that the system is engineered to withstand. The period of mandate intensification eventually exhausts itself, giving way to the final macroeconomic reality of the ABCD rollout. This graph tracks the long-term equilibrium. The primary system achieves mass adoption, but the parallel system solidifies its own dedicated participant base. When we aggregate the historical data from the 10 case studies, spanning Soviet-era repression, the Swiss Weir scale, and centuries of hawala transfers, a consistent pattern of participation emerges. The primary system levels off at roughly 70. The focus must shift to designing the boundary interface between these two distinct tiers of economic life. The resistant remnant will emerge. Engineering the architecture required to sustain it is the only practical response to an integrated digital control system.